"They beat my mom. She's dying." The words echoed in Harlan's mind as he stood at the entrance of his company disguised in the plain uniform of an employee. No one noticed him. The air was thick with apathy, the hum of the office eerily quiet. The once bustling space now felt like a hollow shell filled with lifeless faces, eyes glazed over by exhaustion and disinterest. The sterile, harsh lighting above cast long shadows on their weary expressions. Harlan stood frozen, absorbing the weight of what had become of his company. This was not the vibrant, innovative place he had built. It was a shadow of its former self. A sense of frustration rose within him. He had ignored the cracks, and now the price was clear. Harlan slipped into his new role with quiet determination, donning the uniform of an everyday employee. He worked in the cleaning department among the unnoticed and the underappreciated. No one knew he was the CEO, and that was exactly how he wanted it. As he scrubbed floors and wiped down countertops, he observed the faces around him, worn, dull, absent. There was no energy, no spark in their eyes. The employees shuffled through their tasks, mechanically moving in and out of rooms without a word, without purpose. It was as though they were merely going through the motions, their spirits long extinguished. The cold, sterile environment mirrored the void in their hearts. The hum of machinery replaced the hum of vibrant conversation. This wasn't the company he had built. The realization hit him hard. The very thing he had nurtured, the dream he had poured his life into, had become a place of monotony and disengagement. It was as if the life force of the company had been drained, leaving only empty shells behind. His frustration grew a silent rage that simmered under his calm exterior. Harlan realized that he had been blind to this for too long. He had ignored the cracks, allowed the darkness to fester. Now, standing among his employees, he felt the weight of his failure. He had let it all slip away. Just as Harlan sank deeper into his thoughts, a frantic figure burst into the office. His daughter, barely able to catch her breath, ran toward him, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. Sweat glistened on her forehead and her voice trembled as she gasped. "They beat my mom. She's dying." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His heart lurched and every part of him froze in shock. The world around him seemed to blur as the weight of his daughter's words sank in. Harlan's mind raced. He had to act, and fast. The sterile office, the mechanical hum of work, all of it faded into the background as a primal fear took hold of him. Without a moment's hesitation, he dropped everything. He grabbed his daughter's hand and rushed toward the exit, his pulse pounding in his ears. He didn't look back. The company, the office, the problems he'd been mulling over, they all seemed insignificant in that instant. His wife's life was at stake, and he had no choice but to act. His thoughts were consumed with the image of her bruised and broken, helpless. He could no longer remain idle. This was real. And the panic that surged through him was not just that of a father in distress, it was the first real urgency he had felt in a long time. After ensuring his daughter was taken care of at the hospital, Harlan returned to the company, his mind still clouded with worry. As he walked through the dimly lit halls, he stumbled upon a scene that caught him off guard. A janitor who Harlan had hardly noticed before was kneeling beside a colleague, calmly attending to a man who had collapsed in the corridor. The janitor moved with an ease that seemed almost unnatural, his hands steady as he applied pressure to the man's wound. Harlan watched, confused, his curiosity piqued. The janitor's presence was quiet, yet commanding, an unassuming figure, yet somehow everything in the room seemed to center around him. When the injured man finally began to stir, the janitor's work was done. No one else could have managed so quickly, so efficiently. As the man was helped to his feet, the janitor's eyes met Harlan's for the first time. There was no recognition, no surprise in the janitor's gaze, only a calm assurance. Harlan approached, his mind racing, and the janitor, as if sensing his confusion, offered a quiet, almost reluctant explanation. "I can heal," he said simply, his voice steady but tinged with an unspoken sadness. Harlan stood frozen. The revelation hit him hard, leaving him stunned. The man wasn't just a janitor. He was someone with a gift, a power Harlan had never imagined. The enormity of the moment settled over him like a cold wave. The janitor, the most overlooked person in the building, had abilities that could change everything. Harlan's mind began to race again. How had he missed this? How many others were hidden, their potential wasted, simply because no one took the time to see them? The shock of it all left him questioning everything he thought he knew about his company, about the people he employed, and about himself. Harlan's curiosity led him to spend more time with the janitor, trying to understand the man who had surprised him so profoundly. As they conversed, the janitor slowly revealed his past, a brilliant doctor once celebrated for his skills until the medical field rejected him. He had chosen to walk away from his prestigious career, disillusioned with the system, and had instead embraced a quieter, simpler life as a janitor. The revelation hit Harlan hard. The man he had seen as just another worker was someone who had once been at the peak of his field. Harlan couldn't fathom how someone so capable could be reduced to this. He had been so focused on the success of his business, so wrapped up in profits and progress, that he had completely overlooked the people who made the company function. This man, once a doctor, was now mopping floors, his talents wasted. Harlan's realization stung. He had failed to see the potential in his employees, had failed to recognize their worth. The weight of that oversight began to settle heavily on him, and for the first time, Harlan felt the sharp sting of regret. How many others had he ignored, judged by their position rather than their abilities? The answer was painfully clear. One evening, as Harlan and the janitor continued their conversations, a story emerged that Harlan could hardly believe. The janitor, as it turned out, was the man who had saved Harlan's father years ago in a life-threatening situation. Harlan sat in stunned silence as the janitor recounted the details. It had been a dangerous accident, one that should have killed his father, but the janitor, then a doctor, had been there working at the scene. He had saved Harlan's father's life, but somehow, over the years, Harlan had never known his name or recognized the man who had once been so important to his family. Harlan felt a rush of disbelief and guilt. How could he not have known? The shock of the revelation left him, paralyzed his mind, struggling to reconcile the janitor with the man who had once been a hero in his life. The guilt, sharp and overwhelming, gnawed at him. He had spent so much time ignoring the value of people like the janitor, people who had once held incredible power and purpose. Now, Harlan was faced with a man who had shaped his family's fate, standing before him, hidden in plain sight. The realization hit Harlan with full force. This was no ordinary employee. This was someone who had been a silent giant in his life, and Harlan had never known. Harlan's world had shifted. He could no longer ignore the stark reality of what he had overlooked. The janitor, a man with immense potential, had been reduced to the background, dismissed without thought. The company had been built on the idea that everyone had value, but Harlan realized that he had failed to see it. This was a turning point. He could either continue the status quo or make a bold decision to change. And change was what he chose. Harlan began to reimagine the structure of his company, one where every employee, no matter their title, was valued for their contribution. The janitor, once invisible, would now be brought to the forefront. It wasn't just a professional decision, it was a deeply personal one. Harlan knew this would be a test of his leadership and values. The decision was not without risks, but it felt like the right one. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became. He had been driven by the wrong priorities for too long, profit, efficiency, control, but now, for the first time, he was driven by something greater: fairness and respect. His decision felt liberating, as though a heavy burden was being lifted. As he moved forward, Harlan knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but it was a road worth taking. This was his chance to right the wrongs, not just for his company, but for himself. Harlan took the first crucial step toward changing the company, starting with a shift in its HR policies. He understood that true transformation couldn't happen in isolation. It required breaking down the walls that separated management from the rest of the employees. He called for a new approach, one where leaders worked alongside their teams, not from behind closed office doors. This wasn't just about restructuring. It was about real human connection. The first meetings with department heads were uncomfortable. There were raised eyebrows and whispers of resistance, but Harlan remained firm. His actions spoke louder than his words. He made sure to be visible working alongside employees, encouraging transparency. It was clear that this was more than just a corporate strategy. This was about building trust and accountability. He didn't just want to change policies. He wanted to change the culture. The slow, steady process of transformation had begun. While not everyone was on board yet, there was a flicker of hope in the air, a hope that something better could emerge from the cracks that had long been ignored. Harlan knew this wasn't the end of the battle, but the first step toward reclaiming what the company had lost its soul. As expected, the changes Harlan initiated did not sit well with the senior management team. The push for transparency, for a closer relationship between the leadership and employees, was met with resistance. These leaders, entrenched in their comfortable positions, feared that their authority would be undermined. A tense meeting followed. The room buzzed with frustration as department heads questioned the effectiveness of such drastic changes. They argued that Harlan was undermining their control, threatening the balance they had grown accustomed to. Harlan felt the weight of their skepticism, but he stood his ground. He didn't back down. The confrontation was uncomfortable, raw, but necessary. The pressure was building, and with it a deeper resolve settled into Harlan's chest. He had known the risks. He knew that change was never easy, but he also understood that without it, the company would continue to wither. The stakes were higher now. The resistance from those who had benefited from the status quo only solidified his belief that this path was the right one. There was no turning back. The conflict had only just begun. Despite the fierce opposition from senior management, a surprising shift began to take place at the ground level. Employees, many of whom had been disillusioned by years of neglect, began to rally behind Harlan. They felt his sincerity and began to believe in the possibility of real change. Harlan noticed the subtle yet undeniable shift in energy. Where once there had been indifference, now there was a spark of hope. To further encourage this movement, Harlan held a company-wide meeting offering everyone from entry-level staff to seasoned veterans the opportunity to speak up. The room, once quiet and disconnected, became a space for dialogue and shared purpose. Employees, some hesitant at first, began to express their concerns and ideas openly. Their voices, once stifled, were heard. This was the beginning of a new era for the company. The sense of unity and mutual respect that began to form was palpable. As the meeting concluded, Harlan felt a wave of relief and optimism. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time he felt a true connection with his employees. The changes had started to take root, and the once divided company was beginning to heal. As Harlan spent more time with the janitor, he began to see more than just a man cleaning the floors. There was a quiet wisdom in him, an understanding of life and work that Harlan had never expected. The janitor shared his views on fairness, kindness, and the value of human dignity, speaking with a sincerity that struck Harlan deeply. It wasn't just his ability to heal that was extraordinary, it was his perspective, his ability to see the bigger picture when others could not. Harlan began to realize that this man with all his unspoken wisdom could truly change the direction of the company if given the chance. The more they talked, the more Harlan felt the weight of his own ignorance. He had spent years building a company based on profits and performance, but here was someone who understood the true meaning of leadership and humanity. The connection between them deepened in these quiet moments, and Harlan found himself admiring the janitor, not just for his skills, but for the heart and soul he had given to a life most people ignored. It was as though he had stumbled upon a hidden treasure, one that had been in plain sight all along. The janitor's advice came slowly, but with a clarity that Harlan couldn't ignore. He spoke of the people at the bottom, the ones who rarely had a voice yet carried the weight of the company on their shoulders. If you want to change this place, he said, you need to start with them. The ones you don't see, the ones who clean, who fix, who make it all work in the background. Harlan listened, each word resonating deeply within him. The janitor's perspective was nothing like the top-down management strategies Harlan had known. It was about lifting up the overlooked, about recognizing the value in every person, regardless of their title. For the first time, Harlan realized how disconnected he had become from the very people who made the company function. The janitor's words were a mirror reflecting Harlan's failure to see the humanity in his employees. The shift in his thinking was subtle but profound. This advice, simple yet profound, began to transform Harlan's approach to leadership. He understood now that it wasn't just about profits and efficiency, it was about creating a culture where everyone mattered. The change he needed to make wasn't just structural, it was deeply personal. As Harlan's vision for change began to take shape, the shareholders grew increasingly concerned. The rapid changes were unsettling, and they feared that Harlan's focus on humanity and fairness might jeopardize the company's profitability. A tense meeting was scheduled, and the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The shareholders made their position clear: either deliver results soon or they would force him out. The pressure was palpable. Harlan stood at the center, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. The threat was real. If the changes didn't yield tangible results quickly, he would lose everything. The tension in the room was suffocating. Harlan could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to crumble. But he didn't. Instead, he stood firm, knowing that the stakes had never been higher. He was caught between two worlds, one that demanded profit above all else, and another that called for a more humane approach. In that moment, Harlan realized that this was no longer just about business. It was about standing by his values, even if it meant risking his position. The battle was no longer just external. It had become a fight for his own integrity. Harlan's decision was final. He would not back down. The board's pressure to maintain the status quo, to return to the old ways of doing things, was immense. But Harlan had already made his choice. The risk was undeniable. If the changes didn't work, if they failed to turn the company around, he would lose everything: his position, his reputation, and the very vision he had fought for. But the stakes were too high to turn back. He was all in. He placed his bets on the future, on a chance to fundamentally alter the direction of the company, even if it meant losing it all. The tension was palpable both inside him and in the room with the board members. They wanted immediate results. They wanted reassurance. But Harlan knew better than to offer them false promises. His vision wasn't about quick wins, it was about sustainable growth, a new way forward. As he stared down the board, members, a quiet but unshakable resolve settled in. His conviction was clear. He had reached a point of no return, and the decision to go all in felt both terrifying and necessary. The next few months would define everything, but in his gut, he knew it was the only way forward. As the changes Harlan implemented began to take shape, the first signs of progress were unmistakable. Employees who had once moved through their tasks with a sense of apathy now began to show a flicker of engagement. The atmosphere in the office shifted slowly but noticeably. There was more energy, more collaboration, and an undeniable sense of purpose. The janitor, once overlooked, was now seen in a new light. He became a symbol of the change Harlan had been striving for, a reminder that every person in the company mattered. The people Harlan had once neglected, the ones at the bottom of the hierarchy, were now stepping forward. They were proud, motivated, and more connected to their work than ever before. For Harlan, this shift was the first true reward for the risk he had taken. The results were starting to show, and they weren't just financial. The company was evolving into something more human, more compassionate. The reaction from the employees was clear. They were beginning to trust Harlan again. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about culture. The future, which had once seemed uncertain, now felt promising. Just as things were beginning to stabilize, an internal crisis erupted. One of the key departments in the company, a vital component to its operation, experienced a significant breakdown. The consequences were immediate and severe. Employees were stressed, tasks were delayed, and the flow of work came to a halt. The board, already critical of Harlan's changes, seized on this opportunity to challenge him. They demanded he reverse course, abandon his plans, and return to the old way of doing things. The pressure mounted from all sides. Time was running out, and the future of the company hung in the balance. Harlan felt the weight of their expectations crushing down on him. His resolve, once unshakable, now felt like a fragile thread. This was the moment he had feared, the point where everything he had worked for could unravel. But deep down, Harlan knew that this was the true test of his leadership. He couldn't give in. Not now, not after everything that had been risked. The tension in the air was suffocating as Harlan worked tirelessly trying to fix the damage, trying to prove that his vision could work, that it was the only way forward. The moment of truth had arrived. The company was now faced with its toughest trial, yet one that required the entire workforce to pull together in a way they never had before. This was the test Harlan had feared, the one that would determine the viability of all the changes he had pushed for. There was no turning back. The project was critical, a make-or-break moment that could either cement the future of the company or send it spiraling back into its previous state of mediocrity. Tensions were high. Employees who had once been disengaged were now expected to rise to the occasion to push through their doubts and work as a cohesive unit. Harlan watched as his vision unfolded before him, knowing that the outcome of this single event would either validate or dismantle everything he had worked for. The stakes had never been higher. He could feel the weight of every decision he had made, and the pressure to succeed was almost unbearable. This was no longer just about leadership, it was about survival. The fate of the company rested on this moment. The air was thick with anticipation, and as the hours ticked by, it became clear only by overcoming this challenge could they secure the future. Despite the setbacks, Harlan refused to give up. The pressure from all sides, the board, the employees, and even his own doubts had only reinforced his resolve. He knew the company could still be saved. This wasn't the end, it was a new beginning. Harlan chose to take another shot, to apply the lessons learned from past mistakes and build upon the changes he had already set in motion. There was no sense in retreating now. He revisited his plans, refining them, tweaking the approach to make it stronger, more resilient. The challenges had been many, but they had also been transformative. Harlan's leadership had evolved through the struggles. His determination to reshape the company to make it something that truly served its people was unwavering. He wasn't just trying to restore the company's finances. He was working to rebuild its very foundation. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Harlan felt the strength within himself to keep going. There was no magic formula, no guarantees, just his unshakable belief that change was possible. And so he moved forward one step at a time with the future in his hands. The weight of failure loomed larger with every passing day. Despite Harlan's best efforts, the company was on the verge of collapse. Financially, they were spiraling. The board's patience was running thin, and they made their demands clear. Harlan had to abandon his vision and return to the old ways of doing business. The pressure was suffocating. If Harlan couldn't turn things around in the next quarter, he would lose everything. He stood in front of his team, feeling the magnitude of what was at stake. His vision, his new direction for the company now seemed like a fragile dream. The numbers were worse than he had anticipated, and the shareholders were growing impatient. Their voices echoed in his mind, threatening to drown out everything else. Go back to what works or risk losing it all. Harlan knew this was the moment that would define everything. The company was on the edge, and if he didn't find a way to change the tide, it could all come crashing down. He had no choice but to push harder, dig deeper, and fight for everything he believed in. The future of the company rested on his shoulders. It was all or nothing. Harlan refused to give up. The weight of the company's impending collapse pushed him forward. He couldn't let it all slip away, not after everything he had invested both personally and professionally. He immediately began developing new strategies, brainstorming with a mix of upper-level managers and the overlooked employees. He made a conscious choice to seek input from the janitor, whose insight into the company's culture had proven invaluable. Everyone's voice mattered now. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about creating a system where everyone felt empowered to contribute. Harlan's decision to persevere despite the mounting pressure spoke volumes. Each failure had only driven him further, reinforcing his belief that real change required relentless determination. He didn't know if the changes would work, but he knew that giving up was not an option. In his mind, failure was no longer about the company's finances. It was about abandoning his own moral compass, something he refused to do. The future was still uncertain, but the fire in Harlan's chest remained strong. He wasn't going to walk away, not until he had done everything in his power to turn this ship around. Harlan's vision for the company began to shift once again, this time incorporating technology and innovative processes to modernize its approach. He knew the old ways were no longer enough, so he revamped existing systems, introducing a new framework that would streamline operations and boost productivity. The changes were not instant, but their effects were noticeable. Employees once disheartened by the slow pace of change now saw progress. The hum of the office, which had once been dull and slow, now felt more energetic, more focused. Workers were responding to the changes with renewed enthusiasm, their output improving as the systems in place became more efficient. Harlan saw this as the beginning of something more. It was about more than just improving profits. It was about building a culture that valued both innovation and inclusivity. The new systems not only made work easier, but they also made the workplace more collaborative. The employees now had tools that allowed them to succeed, and with those tools came a sense of empowerment. Harlan watched it unfold. These small, incremental improvements were the first real sign that his vision was beginning to bear fruit. Despite the positive changes within the company, Harlan's progress was far from secure. The shareholders who had been watching closely were not convinced. They had expected immediate financial results, and Harlan's emphasis on culture and long-term growth was not yielding quick returns. Tensions reached a boiling point during the next board meeting. The room was charged with frustration as the shareholders voiced their concerns. They demanded that Harlan abandon his strategy, warning him that failure to return to the tried-and-tested methods of the past would result in severe consequences. The pressure was mounting. Harlan, ever the optimist, knew the path he had chosen was right, but he could feel the weight of the room's skepticism. The sharp words of the shareholders cut through him, their impatience and mistrust palpable. He could sense the challenge before him. He was caught between the ideals he was fighting for and the cold, hard demands of business. The conflict was real, and the stakes were high. Harlan knew this moment would either make or break him. The question wasn't just about the company's future, it was about his ability to hold fast to his beliefs in the face of overwhelming resistance. The first signs of progress were subtle but undeniable. The company, once weighed down by stagnation, began to show small but significant signs of life. Employees who had once walked through their workday mechanically were now more engaged, their movements a little more purposeful. The office, which had felt like a mausoleum just weeks ago, had started to hum again. Harlan could sense the shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but the difference was there. People were talking more, collaborating more, and the energy, though still fragile, was palpable. The early results of his plan were trickling in, and while there was still a long way to go, the first steps were promising. He saw a slight lift in productivity, a spark of creativity that had long been absent. Yet, despite the positive signs, Harlan knew better than to celebrate too soon. The challenges were still abundant. The road to full recovery was long, and the obstacles were far from over. But for the first time in months, there was a sense of optimism, something Harlan had been desperately searching for. His vision, though still in its infancy, had begun to show the faintest glimmer of hope. The company wasn't fixed, but it was alive again. As the days passed, Harlan's relationship with the janitor deepened. The man, once a mere fixture in the background of the company, had become a source of wisdom and insight that Harlan couldn't ignore. Their conversations, once brief and impersonal, had evolved into deep exchanges about life work and the values that drove them both. The janitor shared more about his past, how he had once been a respected doctor, how life had pushed him into the shadows. Harlan listened intently, struck by the humility and resilience of a man who had lived through hardship, yet never let it define him. It wasn't just the janitor's healing abilities that fascinated Harlan, it was his quiet strength, his quiet understanding of what it meant to truly lead. Harlan began to realize that this man, the very one he had once overlooked, had far more to offer than he had ever imagined. The janitor had the potential to change the company not just through his abilities, but through his leadership. What began as a professional relationship was now transforming into a bond of mutual respect. Harlan found himself relying on the janitor's perspective more and more, and with each conversation he understood more about the kind of leader he aspired to be. The janitor had not only changed his perception of him, but had also altered his entire view of leadership. Despite the small victories and the shift in the company's energy, Harlan couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty. The company's recovery was fragile. The positive changes were real, but they were still too fresh, too vulnerable. The shareholders, though cautiously supportive, weren't fully convinced. They still demanded immediate results, impatient for a quicker turnaround. Harlan could feel their doubt, their unease, as they continued to press for more tangible, short-term successes. This pressure hung over him, a constant reminder of how high the stakes were. For every small step forward, the uncertainty of the future lingered. Harlan knew that the path ahead was still murky. Despite the progress, the company's future was far from guaranteed. The risk of failure loomed large. His mind raced with questions: had he made the right decisions? Would his bold vision be enough to secure the company's future? The weight of these questions pressed on him, and as he looked at his team, he couldn't shake the fear that the ground beneath them was still unstable. He had started this journey with a firm belief in change, but the road ahead was still unclear. The sense of hope was tempered by the very real threat of failure. And yet, Harlan couldn't stop. He had come too far to turn back now. The tension in the air was palpable. Harlan had known that change would be met with resistance, but the level of hostility caught him off guard. A meeting was called, and it was clear from the outset that this would be no ordinary gathering. The room was divided, half of the employees and several key shareholders were openly defiant. They saw Harlan's changes as reckless, unnecessary risks. Their voices rose in opposition, demanding a clear strategy with immediate results. They wanted proof that Harlan's vision would work, and they wanted it now. Harlan felt the weight of their criticisms bearing down on him. It wasn't just their words, it was their distrust, their outright rejection of everything he had put into motion. The confrontation was intense, the room charged with an energy that was both uncomfortable and crucial. Harlan stood firm, his resolve unshaken, but he could feel the pressure mounting with every word of doubt thrown his way. The conflicting voices threatened to drown him, but he knew that this moment was inevitable. It was a trial by fire, and no matter the outcome, it would shape the path forward. The company was in turmoil, and Harlan's leadership was now on full display. It wasn't just about ideas anymore. It was about proving to everyone, especially to himself, that his way was the right way. The heat of the confrontation was like a forge, shaping Harlan into the leader he needed to be. He did not flinch in the face of their demands. Calm but resolute, he turned the tide of the meeting with a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. Harlan knew that this moment would define his legacy, and he refused to back down. He addressed each concern methodically, showing the board that his changes were not impulsive, but part of a long-term vision for the company's success. His words were deliberate, his tone unwavering. He spoke of growth, sustainability, and the future principles that had once driven him now made even more vital in the face of adversity. The more he spoke, the more he realized that his resolve had strengthened in the face of this challenge. His confidence began to infect the room, spreading like a spark that ignited the embers of doubt. By the end of the meeting, while the opposition hadn't disappeared, the room had shifted. Harlan's commitment to his vision was evident, and that alone was enough to earn him a renewed sense of respect. He had stood tall in the storm, and in doing so had proven to everyone, including himself, that his leadership could weather the toughest of tests. The aftermath of the tense meeting left Harlan with a mix of exhaustion and cautious optimism. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. The shareholders, who had once been the loudest critics, began to soften. They watched, they listened, and they saw the results beginning to take shape, albeit slowly. Slowly but surely they began to accept that Harlan's vision might not only be feasible, but could be the key to their long-term success. One by one, they started to come around. What had once been a fractured hostile group now appeared more unified. It wasn't instant, but the change in attitude was undeniable. Harlan knew that trust was earned, and he had taken the first steps toward earning it. The room that had once been filled with resistance now held the potential for cooperation. The shift in perspective was subtle, but powerful, a silent agreement that maybe Harlan's way was the right way. The breakthrough was not just in the financials, but in the hearts and minds of the people who had the power to shape the company's fate. Harlan had succeeded in changing not only the company's direction, but its very culture. And with that, he knew the company's future had just taken its first solid step towards sustainability. The first major steps towards Harlan's vision were now in motion. The company began to implement the new strategies that had been carefully crafted in the face of resistance. Each decision, each initiative marked a shift in the company's approach. The changes weren't immediate, but the effects were beginning to show. Employees started noticing the difference in how things were being handled, and the ripple effects were beginning to reach beyond just the boardroom. Processes were streamlined, and departments that had once been stagnant now hummed with activity. It wasn't just about efficiency, it was about creating a work environment where every employee had a sense of purpose. The company's financial outlook slowly began to improve as well, though it was still fragile. But for the first time in months, there was a sense of momentum, a feeling that the company was headed in the right direction. Harlan could feel the hope rising within the walls of the office. The changes, while not fully realized, were laying the groundwork for something lasting. Employees were beginning to buy into the new culture, and that trust was the foundation for everything that came next. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And in this moment, progress felt like victory. As the dust began to settle from the initial upheaval, Harlan started to see the changes manifest in the hearts and minds of his employees. They were no longer the same group of disillusioned workers he had seen when he first stepped into the company's broken halls. Now there was a sense of mutual respect in the air. Employees began to feel valued, not just as workers but as individuals contributing to something larger. They were starting to see the changes Harlan had promised. There was a shift in their demeanor, an openness in their interactions. Harlan no longer felt like an outsider to his own company. The walls that had once stood between him and the employees were slowly crumbling. The feeling of alienation which had once been so palpable was now replaced with a sense of belonging. Employees who had once been skeptical were now some of the loudest advocates for Harlan's vision. They trusted him. They believed in the direction he was taking them. And for Harlan, that trust felt like the ultimate validation. It wasn't just about financial results, it was about the cultural transformation that was taking root. The company had come alive again, and it was because of the people who worked within it. Just as things seemed to be turning around, a new challenge emerged, one that cut deeper than the others. Some employees, those who had once been Harlan's closest allies, began to resist the changes in ways that weren't just passive. There were whispers, quiet acts of defiance, and an unmistakable sense of betrayal. Harlan had expected pushback, but this felt different. These were people he had trusted, people who had stood beside him in the fight to turn the company around. Now it seemed they were working in the shadows, undermining his efforts at every turn. The weight of their betrayal was sharp, cutting through the progress he had worked so hard to build. The tension within the company rose once again. Harlan felt both personally and professionally betrayed. The anger and disappointment were palpable. He had given everything for this vision, and now the people who had once believed in it were attempting to tear it down. It was a painful blow, and the trust he had worked so hard to build began to feel fragile. Yet, in the midst of this betrayal, Harlan knew he couldn't give up. The company needed him now more than ever. But the feeling of isolation that had once haunted him returned with a vengeance, a stark reminder of how fragile loyalty could be. Harlan knew that the time had come to act. The betrayal within his company wasn't just a personal wound, it was a cancer that threatened to undo everything he had worked for. He could no longer afford to ignore it. With quiet resolve, he set out to confront the disloyal employees who had worked against him. This wasn't about revenge, it was about preserving the integrity of the company. Harlan made a decision to remove the negativity, the destructive forces that had once been allies, but had now become liabilities. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. One by one, those who had conspired against him were confronted, their actions exposed. The weight of their betrayal made the process sting, but Harlan knew it was the only way to restore order. He stood firm, unwavering in his commitment to fairness even when the consequences were painful. The act of decisively eliminating these threats was in Harlan's mind an act of justice. He understood the price of leadership wasn't just about vision and success, it was about maintaining integrity, no matter the cost. The company could not move forward while carrying the burden of disloyalty. And so, with an ironclad will, Harlan began the painful process of purging the rot, making the tough but necessary choices to cleanse the company and return it to its true purpose. The winds of change that Harlan had set in motion finally began to bear fruit in the most significant way. After months of struggle, one of his major projects, once deemed too ambitious, was completed, and the results were nothing short of spectacular. The success of the initiative reverberated through the company, sparking a renewed sense of hope and purpose. For the first time, Harlan could feel the full weight of what he had hoped for. The company was not just surviving, but thriving. Employees who had been uncertain or resistant were now on board, seeing the very real, very tangible outcomes of the changes Harlan had pushed for. The project was a monumental success not only in financial terms, but in its ability to reshape the company's culture. What had once been a fractured and disjointed organization was beginning to feel like a cohesive team united by a common goal. This success wasn't just a victory for Harlan, it was a triumph for the people who had believed in his vision and had weathered the storm alongside him. The company had turned a corner, and for the first time in a long while, the future felt bright. Harlan knew this was only the beginning, but this moment was a victory he could savor. The final phase of Harlan's transformation had arrived. The changes were no longer theoretical or gradual, they had become a lived reality, and the company reflected it in every way. The new systems were fully integrated, and the employees once hesitant were now fully on board. There was an efficiency in the air, a sense of purpose that permeated every department. The culture had shifted from one of disillusionment to one of possibility. The work was no longer a chore, but a shared mission. Harlan looked at the team he had built, and for the first time he saw the results of his vision realized in its entirety. The systems were working seamlessly, communication had improved, and productivity was up. The company was moving as one, and its trajectory was clear. What Harlan had set out to do was now not just a dream, it was a thriving reality. And as he stood in the midst of it all, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. These were the results of his decisions, the culmination of everything he had sacrificed and fought for. The company was no longer just a business. It had become a testament to the power of change, to the strength of perseverance. It was now everything he had hoped it would be, and more. As the months passed, something shifted between Harlan and his employees. Where once there had been distance, an invisible barrier between him and those who worked under him, there was now a growing sense of mutual respect and understanding. The employees no longer saw him as just the CEO, but as a leader who genuinely cared for their well-being. It wasn't just his vision that had won them over. It was his actions. Harlan had listened, had walked alongside them in the trenches, proving that he valued their voices and their work. This wasn't a hierarchy based on power, but one rooted in collaboration. The office had become a place where everyone was respected regardless of their title or role. There was a sense of unity now, a quiet solidarity in the air. The days of feeling like cogs in a machine were behind them. As Harlan looked around at his team, he could feel that a bond had been forged, built on trust and mutual respect. Employees no longer walked with their heads down, but with a sense of pride, knowing that they were part of something greater. For the first time in a long while, Harlan felt like a true leader, not because of his position, but because of the connection he had formed with his people. The company that Harlan had fought so hard to rebuild was finally thriving. The results spoke for themselves, revenues were climbing, and the once bleak financial forecasts were now filled with promise. The employees who had once been disillusioned and disconnected were now energized, working with a renewed sense of purpose. There was an undeniable buzz in the air as the company began to not only recover but excel. The recovery wasn't just financial, it was cultural. The environment was now one of collaboration, innovation, and shared ambition. The transformation was real, and it was tangible. Harlan walked through the office with a quiet sense of pride. The company was now a reflection of the values he had instilled: integrity, fairness, and a deep commitment to the people who made it all possible. The results were undeniable. The stockholders, once skeptical, were now reaping the rewards of Harlan's bold decisions. The turnaround had been nothing short of miraculous, and the company was now positioned for long-term success. Harlan knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time in years, he could allow himself to truly savor the victory. His vision had become reality. Harlan stood at the helm of a company that had not only survived but flourished, and the recognition that followed was well-earned. No longer was he just seen as a CEO, but as a leader who had the foresight, courage, and compassion to turn things around. His name became synonymous with transformation. The employees who had once felt overlooked now looked up to him with admiration. They saw him not only as a figurehead, but as someone who truly understood their struggles and aspirations. Even the shareholders who had been wary of his unconventional approach now recognized his brilliance. Harlan had proven that leadership was not just about profit margins. It was about people. As the company became a model of positive change in the business world, Harlan was finally able to step back and appreciate the fruits of his labor. The path had been difficult, filled with uncertainty and opposition, but it had been worth it. The respect he had earned from those around him wasn't just for his business acumen, it was for the man he had become: a leader who understood that true success is built on empathy and integrity. Harlan's kindness, once a quiet whisper in the halls, began to resonate throughout the company. His actions, simple yet profound, planted seeds of empathy in the hearts of his employees. As they watched him lead, not with authority but with understanding, they began to mirror his behavior. The culture shifted slowly at first, but soon with undeniable force. Employees, once focused solely on their tasks, now took the time to help one another. Kindness became a currency, something shared, exchanged, and valued by all. The ripple effect was clear. Those who worked under Harlan started to treat each other with the same care and respect he showed them. The atmosphere, once heavy with tension, now felt lighter. In the small, everyday actions, helping a colleague, listening without judgment, offering support, Harlan's vision of a compassionate workplace flourished. The transformation wasn't just in the company's financials, but in the hearts of its people. They had learned from their leader, and they had become leaders themselves, spreading compassion to every corner of the company. After years of chaos, uncertainty, and struggle, Harlan finally felt the calm he had been seeking. The company, now a thriving, cohesive entity, had settled into a rhythm of steady growth. The once constant pressure was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. Harlan stood in the middle of the office watching his employees collaborate, their faces relaxed, their spirits lifted. The company was no longer just a business. It was a community. He had done it. His vision had not only reshaped the company, but had also transformed the people within it. The turmoil was behind him, and in its place was the peace of knowing that his decisions had been right. There was no more doubt, no more fear. Harlan could now take a deep breath, knowing that he had brought about lasting change. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in a long time, it was one he walked with calm certainty. Harlan stood in the heart of the company, watching his team work with purpose, their energy flowing into every task. The transformation was undeniable. The change he had fought for wasn't just a vision, it was now their reality. What had once felt impossible was now the foundation of their daily lives. The struggles, the risks, the doubts, none of it mattered anymore. What remained was the satisfaction of knowing he had turned the tide. He hadn't just saved a company, he had reshaped lives, including his own. This was the moment of completion, the culmination of everything that had brought them here together.